Hello, Supernatural Folklore. Welcome to week 12. If you're keeping count, we have 4 weeks of class left. Um, just as a reminder, this is our last week talking about witches. Next week, we will begin talking about aliens. And then after aliens, you have a review and a final exam. So we're almost there. Thank you, those of you that have turned in your drafts or outlines of your research paper. I'm currently working through those right now and giving feedback on those. Please remember that this feedback is not intended to be critical or make you feel bad about the work that you've done so far. It's just to make sure that you have all the information that you need to head out on the right direction. I don't know if you guys are familiar with a writer named Anne Lamott, but she has written some books on the craft of writing. And one of the things that she writes about in her books is something called shitty first drafts. And she talks about the fact that most first drafts, when they're done, are not great. And you need feedback on those drafts to help them improve. So when you're looking at your draft and you're getting feedback on it, remember that shitty first drafts are always okay. And they're certainly better than no draft at all. So hang in there. If you have questions, ask me. I would also recommend talking with the librarians at the library. I would also recommend making an appointment with the Writing Center. Both of those are resources that you're paying for with your tuition, and so I certainly advocate that you take advantage of those. And my goal is to have feedback back to you on those drafts early in the week so that you have time to implement it. You have about 2 weeks before the paper's due, so you have time to implement that feedback. Um, if you did not turn a draft into me, I would recommend that you do that and do that with some alacrity. That way, you can get feedback and your paper can be really good when you turn it in. So, this week is our second week of talking about witches. We're going to start with a discussion of sympathetic magic, which is not something that I had to read an article about because it's a big issue and it would take up a lot of your time to read about it. So I figure if I give you the information via lecture, you still have the information and I'll save you a little bit of reading. So the idea of sympathetic magic comes to us courtesy of a guy named James Frazer. And he was a Scottish folklorist, and he wrote a book that was pretty influential in 1889. So it's a little bit old, but it's called The Golden Bough. And in that book, he sort of lays down the principles that underlie a lot of the scholarship on mythology and comparative religions, even today. In this modern age, we tend to criticize the ways in which Frazer characterizes peasants and indigenous people. He sort of looks at them as being like primitive and fossilized and in less advanced stages of cultural evolution. And those are ideas that we've kind of discarded in our modern era. But he says, quote, thus, generally stated, the two things may be a little difficult to grasp. And he's talking there about the two branches of sympathetic magic. But they will readily become intelligible when they are illustrated by particular examples. Both trains of thought are, in fact, extremely simple and elementary. It could hardly be otherwise since they are familiar in the concrete, though certainly not in the abstract, to the crude intelligence not only of the savage, but of ignorant and dull-witted people everywhere. So generally, again, we don't characterize our subjects as being ignorant and dull-witted or savage. Um, Characterizing folks as being less primitive than us certainly kind of gives off an air of snootiness that we don't want to portray in scholarship anymore. Um, so we've kind of ignored that part. But there are other aspects of his work that are still widely studied in anthropology, in archaeology, and in psychology and sociology. So some of his ideas are still relevant. Let's just discard some of the dismissive attitudes that he has towards some of his subjects. So Frazer coined the term sympathetic or imitative magic, And he describes it as number one, the law of similarity, which relies on correspondence. Or number two, the law of contagion, which relies on contact. So I'm going to break those down a little bit further. The law of similarity is based on the notion that one thing can influence something else based on its relationship or resemblance to something else. All right. So Fraser describes it as first, that like produces like, or that an effect resembles its cause. So examples of this can help to clarify what it means. This would be something like the belief that walnuts can strengthen the brain because they look like brains, or that one could use the horn of an animal to cure impotence, right? For various reasons that I'm sure you can surmise without me explaining. Charms that are based on the law of similarity may be called homeopathic or imitative magic. Fraser uses the example of trying to harm someone by harming a photograph or likeness of the person, which may put you immediately in mind of a voodoo doll, but I'm going to save that example and talk about that a little bit later. So, law of similarity would be something like, this is Himalayan pink salt, and this is pink wax, right? So pink is largely associated with matters of the heart and love. So you would use something like pink salt and pink wax in a love spell, for example. If you're trying to, influence love, you're doing a love spell or a love charm, you might use items like this that are pink, also things like rose quartz or pink rose petals. The basis being here that the color pink is associated with love, right? So you would tend to choose things that are pink and have that association for those types of spells. That would be an example of the law of similarity, right? Or correspondent magic. The color corresponds to the effect that you want, right? You want to influence the heart. The other branch, the law of contagion, that's number two, that relies on contact. And I'm looking for my, oh dear, oh here it is, okay. So the law of contagion is based on the notion that if something was once in contact with a person, then it can be used to influence the person. All right, so Fraser describes it as whatever he does to the material object will affect equally the person with whom the object was once in contact, whether it formed a part of his body or not. Right? So charms that are based on the law of contagion may be labeled contagious magic. This is the idea that you would take a person's hair or fingernails and use them to affect the person to whom they belonged. So again, I'm going to save the example of voodoo dolls for in just a second, all right? So what I have here is, this is one of my daughter's baby teeth, right? So parents, mothers in particular, tend to keep their children's teeth. There are various reasons for this, largely sentimental. But one of the reasons that I tend to keep my daughter's teeth is because I don't really want anyone else getting hold of them. So the idea that these are my daughter's teeth, and that if someone else have them, they might have some sort of magical control over her. That's one of the reasons I keep her teeth in a safe place, right? So the idea that this tooth that was once my daughter's, it somehow still has an association with her, right? That would be the law of contagion. And the reason that I said that I was going to keep voodoo dolls or puppets for a little bit later is because these things technically would represent both similarity and contagious magic. All right. And the reason I say that is because generally in order for these things to be really effective, they need to have something of the person's associated with them. All right. So, for example, for a puppet, you might include a lock of someone's hair, or their fingernails, or their teeth, or an item of clothing that they wore, or something they slept with, right? And so, by that logic, we would be talking about the law of contagion, right? But generally, we make puppets, and this one's not real well made. It doesn't have hair. Generally, you make puppets in the likeness of the person that you want to affect with them, right? So this puppet would be made to resemble a person. It would be similar to, which would be the law of similarity. Um, Again, these are an example that would be both laws. You can use a photograph with these things, which would also be similarity, right? Um, but contagion also often plays a part in voodoo dolls or puppets when we're talking about them having some kind of magical influence over someone else. All right. So there are other examples of this that we can discuss, and you will have an opportunity to discuss some of those in the discussion board for this week. But basically, I do want you to have an understanding of what sympathetic magic or imitative magic is, because so much of that theory underlines magical thought, particularly when we're talking about witchcraft. So, I want to move on to our article for this week. Our article this week is about the occult having a moment. It's by Knittel. This is a popular source article. And so Nadra Knittel is discussing cultural appropriation. And we talked a little bit about cultural appropriation last week, but it's kind of an important topic, so we're going to talk about it a little bit further. And her central argument here seems to be that corporations are cashing in on neo-paganism, particularly witchcraft, by commodifying its traditions. So within various magical practice, there is the use of tarot sometimes for divination. There's the use of essential oils for various reasons, but they're commonly used in spells. There is the use of crystals, which has different crystals have different associations and correspondences in magical practice. There's the tradition of smudging or using burning herbs, various herbs, usually sage, cedar, lavender, in order to protect or cleanse or increase spiritual associations. And these come from some different areas of practice, right? Particularly smudging or the use of sage or incense or things like that. Those come from different, smudging in particular is used in Native American practice, but the use of incense has been done within various religious and pagan practice for a long time. So what Knittel is saying here is that corporate involvement is bastardizing traditions and twisting magic's purpose by making it something that is consumed rather than something that resides in folks and is accessed by them through practice and ritual. So in much of witchcraft, there's the idea of manifesting intentions and that people have power over their own circumstance. And so a lot of magical practice is the setting of intention and the manifestation of intention. And so magic is something that resides within a person, right? You have the power to manifest those intentions. And you access that through practice and through ritual and through kind of various means of working, but that's within yourself, right? It doesn't come from outside. It doesn't come from the actual object. It's not the actual tarot cards themselves that are magical. It is your interpretation of those. So it's your interaction with them. And so for those who practice witchcraft, they they see magic as the manifestation of their intentions. So the use of spells, of charms, of rituals, that's all in order to reach a goal. And whether that goal is finding a new job, ending or beginning a relationship, or healing themselves or someone else, the key to making any spell or ritual work is the intention of the practitioner. So other beings may be invoked to make the spell work, like gods or goddesses or ancestors. But for witches, intention in harmony with nature and the wider spiritual world is kind of the key to practice, right? So, witchcraft is everywhere, right? Harry Potter was one of the largest commercial successes, but the media has always sold a fantastic version of witchcraft. In many pop culture representations, traditions are often presented as a kind of mishmash, right? They are an adoption of a multitude of different practices from different places. And I like to use the term borrower. In witchcraft, sometimes they use chaos magic or a chaos witch to indicate that they pull ideas and practices and rituals from different areas and kind of compile that into um, their own practice, right? So, um, Niddle's interviewee here, Hurst, points out that the commercialization is often present alongside witchcraft, and it may be that many practitioners' first introduction to the craft is through this kind of commercialism, right? You may not be interested in tarot cards until you receive a pack. She also interviews Dr. Kate Horgan, who is a professor here at WKU, who points out that these beliefs are trivialized and that they are provided without any context of the traditions behind them, right? So you're given a smudge stick, but you're not really given any contextualization about what you need to do with it or how you need to use it or what it actually is supposed to be doing, right? In other words, folks are selling something cool, but they don't have any idea what it means, so they might buy a starter witch kit, assuming it is authentic. There's that troublesome word again, authentic. But it's completely divorced from context. So as Horgan explains in the article, authenticity stems from family customs, oral tradition, religious text, historical records, or how effective a practice is for any one person. Right? So, for example, you can pick up a smudge stick at Five Below. And you can pick it up in a little kit that has a smudge stick and it has a couple crystals in it. And it's basically usually a stick of Palo Alto. And it's like, here, this is what you need to, this is a cleansing kit, right? But it doesn't really tell you anything about what you're supposed to do with it. Now, within the practice of smudging or burning incense or cleansing, anything like that, some people really object to the use of smudging as being an appropriation of Native American practice. But I commonly hear the practice referred to as smudging. So, smudging, cleansing, whatever kind of term you want to use for that. What that does is remove energy from a space. So, for example, if you move into a new house and you feel that it has bad energy, I'll share a personal story here. When we moved into our house, we knew that the couple that had lived here before us were selling the house because they were getting divorced. And so there was a sort of, the connotation that something happened, something bad happened to that family, and we certainly didn't want that to happen to our family. So being the Girl Scout that I am and always being prepared, I decided that it was probably a good idea to go ahead and smudge the house and remove any negative energy that was left behind, right? I know some of you don't believe in that, and that's okay. So I got my smudge stick and I went through the house and I smudged the house. And so once you remove that energy, you have to, if you don't know what you're doing, you've removed the energy and you've left this void, and nature abhors a void, so something will fill it up, right? So really and truthfully, if you're going to smudge something or cleanse it, then you need to replace that with positive, good energy, right? Which is what I tried to do after we cleansed this house. So we went through, we smudged, we cleansed the house, and then, really tried to fill it with good, positive energy to remove whatever negative energy might have been left here. So if you don't know that, if you don't know that you're removing energy from a place, then you don't know how to fill that with something else. So you're taking a practice and you're doing it, but you have no context for how it works or what's supposed to be done. And that's really kind of what Knittel has a problem with here. They're selling this kit, they're not telling you anything about what you're supposed to do with it, what the significance of it is. There's no context at all. And so really doing that kind of trivializes the practice because you don't know what you're doing or what you're supposed to do. And that's not really your fault, but and we'll discuss the role that others have to play in that, right? So, witchcraft has been in and out of fashion for a very long time, and Knittel kind of traces the progression of that here. There's always been, to an extent, commodification involved in magic because it contains a lot of material culture. All right, there are altars, there are things that are supposed to go on altars, there are crystals, there are, various physical components that are involved in the practice of most witchcraft. So there's always been some commodification involved in magic. And Knittel points out that when race is involved, the issue of appropriation gets more problematic, right? So we're talking about Native Americans, we're talking about hoodoo. Hoodoo is African American folk magic, Santeria. All of those have white-owned businesses selling products related to those practices, which make millions of dollars in revenue every year. And so this is particularly problematic when the ancestors of these practitioners, people who practice Native American religious traditions, people who practiced hoodoo, people who practiced Santeria, people who practiced voodoo, all of those folks have been discriminated against because of their beliefs. But now, because those beliefs are popular, you have white-owned businesses making money off of practices that used to be criminalized for the cultures that practiced them. All right. And there are a lot of people that see that as being problematic. Right. So one of Knittel's interviewees acknowledges that this makes her feel conflicted. On the one hand, so this was a interviewee whose parents practiced Santeria. So on the one hand, her parents can embrace being brujos, but now it's also being sold in a store, and in effect, anyone can sort of be their own brujos. All right. But they don't really know and don't really have the context to be able to do that, right? And there was a lot of discrimination and persecution of folks who were brujos, but now that it's cool, that's all okay. And there are folks that have a problem with that outlook. So one of Knittel's interviewees, Mecca Woods, advises that companies who want to avoid charges of appropriation work collaboratively with practitioners rather than try to remove the source of legitimacy, right? So rather than not providing any context at all, go to practitioners of that and have them provide some context for the items or what people are getting or what they're supposed to do with that. Excuse me. She suggests that these partnerships allow for structured learning for folks who are interested, as well as making money and gaining exposure. And so within this, there's often a discussion about using that problematic word authentic, but buying products that are created by practitioners who actually practice whatever it is, right? And so you'll find that some of those practitioners are often set up at, say, Ren fairs or, other places where people who are into that kind of thing might show up, and they they are making far less money from their products. but they are often making money because of this association with authenticity. And remember that I told you guys, authentic often has an economic piece attached to it. So if you're looking, people will pay more for an experience they consider to be authentic. But since there's someone who's outside of the culture, they may not understand exactly what authentic is. So they may be calling something authentic when it's not actually the way that something would be practiced or presented or done at all. It's just that they're catering to that touristy idea of what is authentic. All right, so that's why authentic becomes a problematic term for folklorists in a lot of ways. And there's that there's that question about who determines what is authentic. Is it the person inside the culture that actually practices the culture, or is it the person who is, touring the culture for whatever reason? Um, so Niddle points out that those who practice the occult are still persecuted in some countries, and they face discrimination in far more from folks who have a more traditional religious culture or who have a very, very skeptical culture. And so you will find that most people who practice witchcraft or neo-paganism in any form have a variety of stories to tell about their encounters with folks who are from traditional religious backgrounds. And those will usually include, proselytizing, telling they're going to hell, and a wide variety of um, unkind practices. So, generally, the advice here is generally in this, as in any religious practice, it's generally better to seek out a practitioner and learn about these traditions rather than to try to borrow them with no context whatsoever. So a little research and a little study and a little conversation can go a very long way in kind of avoiding this charge of cultural appropriation. If what you actually want to do, if you are actually interested in and want to appreciate the cultural practice, then it's usually better to talk with someone who actually practices it and have some context for what you're doing. So that is our lecture for this week. Remember that those research papers are going to be due in a couple of weeks. I know you have other research papers that are due. You have other finals you need to study for. I realize this is not the only class, but do try to make that research paper a priority at some point during the next couple of weeks. And we'll be talking about that more as we go on. Again, if you have questions or concerns, please email me. If it's an emergency, your computer ate your research paper, that's one of those things that you might want to text me about, because I usually only check my email a couple times a day. So rather than stress out about it, it's probably good to drop me a text on that. All right, guys, have a good week, and I will talk to you again soon.